Okay, I think the recording started. So yes, welcome to this Expert Voices seminar. My name is Phil Bowen, Director of the Centre for Justice Innovation. Just a bit about the centre itself. So we are a not-for-profit which seeks to build a justice system which every citizen believes is fair and effective. We believe the justice system should be focused on solving the issues that drive crime and social harm, and it should be fair in how it treats people. We do a range of work to deliver that vision. We provide hands-on support to practitioners. We conduct research into how things work right now and how they could work better in the future. And we promote evidence-based and innovative justice policy reforms. So this Expert Voices seminar series is very much at the heart of the approach that the centre has. This seminar is the first of a series of Expert Voice seminars which seek to discuss key issues affecting the justice system. This series is free and open to everyone. So this seminar is also part of a much wider programme of work that we do at the centre to promote the voices of both practitioners and academics who are leading on crucial issues that cut across the justice system. The seminar series is linked to a range of blogs titled Expert Voices and to our map of innovation, which charts innovative projects happening across the UK's justice systems, and we'll put a website link in the chat to our wonderful map of innovation. So today's seminar, which is about neurodiversity, we are privileged to have two wonderful guest speakers who will speak for roughly 10 minutes each, and then there'll be time for the Q&A. So firstly, let me introduce Dr. Tom Smith. He's the Associate Professor of Law at the University of the West of England, Bristol. His research focuses on suspects and defendant rights, pre-trial detention, and neurodivergence in the criminal justice system. And he's the founder and joint co-coordinator, of the Neurodivergence Criminal Justice Network, which is a group of academics, practitioners, and community members promoting research and knowledge exchange and evidence-led practice. So Tom will speak first, and then we will have, we're delighted to welcome Detective Constable Nicole Jury, Detective Constable at Thames Valley Police. She's been with Thames Valley for 5 years, both in uniform and the last 20 months being a detective on the Criminal Investigation Department. She has ADHD and dyslexia and set up the ADHD Support Network with her inspector, and they are now the leads for the external strand of the wider Neurodiversity Support Network for Thames Valley Police. So obviously a great lineup of speakers to talk about this crucial issue, which gets to the heart of fairness and effectiveness in the criminal justice system. After they've spoken, I will open up to the Q&A, and just a reminder, you type your questions throughout the talk in the chat box, stating your name and where you're from. So without further ado, I will ask Dr. Tom Smith to do his presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? And you can see the slides okay? That's great. Thank you very much, first of all, to Phil for such a kind introduction, and to the Centre for inviting me to speak this morning on a subject which is very kind of close to my heart personally, but is very much having a golden moment, I would say, in terms of the criminal justice system and improving its fairness and effectiveness. So I'm going to do a brief, I guess what we might call, overview of some issues, particularly focusing on the policing stage of the criminal justice system. It's a big topic, so I'm not going to try and cover everything. So forgive me if you feel there are things I miss out. This is a brief overview of what I'm going to cover. I'm going to briefly give an idea of what neurodivergence is. I'd say it's a very difficult thing to pin down, but hopefully I can give a decent definition. A little bit of context about recent developments and interest in this area, particularly at a policy-making level. I'm then going to talk a bit about some of the challenges that research suggests currently exist in relation to neurodivergent suspects in the community, on the street, when interacting with police officers. neurodivergent suspects who are brought into custody, but also the challenges that arise for support figures engaging with neurodivergent individuals. And when I say support figures, I'm talking about people like lawyers, appropriate adults, liaison and diversion services. And then finally, I'm going to try and look forward by thinking about some of the things that could change, some recommendations, or at least a few, which could help meet some of these challenges. So to begin with, possibly the hardest bit of the presentation really, which is defining neurodivergence. It's a term which is open to significant debate, I would suggest. It's quite an open and developing concept, but at its heart, I would say it's about cognitive development that is not typical. The idea that everybody's brain develops differently, and therefore we have different ways of perceiving and engaging with the world around us. I do want to kind of draw a quick contrast between two different terms though. Neurodivergent is a bit different to neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is essentially the idea that all brains are different. They are diverse. People who are neurodivergent have brains which have developed differently. So, for example, if you have ADHD, you would be neurodivergent. If you're autistic, you would be neurodivergent. It's kind of quite an open umbrella term. It's quite closely associated with a variety of medical conditions, but it's not a medical term in and of itself. And really, neurodivergence emphasizes what I would say was difference rather than disorder, which is much more focused on the sort of the medical side of things. So some of the kind of conditions which are included would be things like autism, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and many more. And whilst it's quite difficult to say all of the different things that neurodivergence can relate to, it typically affects things like social communication, learning, attention, sensory processing, and mood regulation, amongst many other things. So hopefully that gives a fairly reasonable definition of what we mean when we're talking about neurodivergence. Now, a little bit of context about this concept in criminal justice. Criminal justice, as I think everybody can appreciate, is a challenging process per se for anybody who's drawn into it. It can be confusing, it's very likely to be stressful, it's complex, it involves possibly lots of different people over over a long period of time, potentially. But this can be even more the case for neurodivergent individuals for several reasons, particularly because there is an emphasis on verbal communication in passing through the criminal justice system. There's lots of complex language and jargon which can be used. There are many unfamiliar and alien processes which people have to engage with, and there can be significantly restrictive environments, including custody, courts, and prisons. Now, up to this point, or at least up to the last few years, there'd been pretty limited attention on neurodivergence amongst policymakers and criminal justice practitioners. And this was kind of underlined quite well, or very well, I would say, at the end of 2021, when the government published a criminal justice joint inspection, which essentially looked at the evidence on practice, knowledge, understanding and awareness across the CJS, criminal justice system, in relation to neurodivergence. So we're talking about not just policing, but courts, prisons, probation and surrounding services. And obviously, I don't want to boil down a very long report too much, but one of the key quotes that jumped out to me was that there were serious gaps, failings and missed opportunities at every stage of the system in relation to neurodivergence. Now, since that report, there has been quite a big uptick in activity and interest and engagement really across the criminal justice system at both the government level and beyond. So that's the context we're talking about for this area. Alongside that, I think it's also important to try and highlight some of the underpinning difficulties and challenges that arise here and why they've arisen. I would argue that at the kind of heart of these challenges identified by that report was some of the core deficits on the slide here. So, for example, lack of awareness and or training about neurodivergence amongst practitioners, the lack of ability, often because of lack of awareness of practitioners, to be able to identify neurodivergence and individuals who are or may be neurodivergent. And as a result of that, a lack of adapted approaches to engaging with and interacting with individuals who are neurodivergent. So these seem like the kind of key areas that need to be addressed in order to manage some of these challenges. Now, what I want to talk about for the remainder of my presentation, which I'm going to try as hard as I can not to go over time, which is not my strong suit, I'll be honest, are the challenges that exist. What exactly can happen which is problematic or difficult? So I want to split this into two things, really. I want to talk briefly about the street context when particularly police officers engage with neurodivergent individuals in the community and also in custody. And then briefly, I'd like to speak about the support figures I mentioned at the start. So when, as it says on the slide, I talk about interactions, these can include things like stop and search, arrest. It could even be as simple as, simply talking to or engaging with an individual short of those kind of official powers. Now, some of the kind of key concerns are that neurodivergent individuals may behave and communicate in a way which stands out, which does not adhere to common social norms or expectations. And in some situations, these differences can lead to an arousal of suspicion, an arousal of something is not right here, something is unusual. And, in some situations, this may be just, but in many, this may be unjust, and it may lead to a focus on an individual which is not needed. Added to this, if an interaction kind of begins between a neurodivergent individual and an officer, that individual may not fully understand the interaction. They may not be able to engage with and access it for reasons I'll expand on in a moment. And they, of course, may also find it traumatizing and stressful, much more so than a neurotypical individual. In addition to this, suspects who are neurodivergent may simply not be able to respond in a way that's appropriate or best for their interests during an interaction. And this might, for one reason or another, lead to escalation. And again, I'll expand on this in a moment. So coming back to the idea of certain behaviours seeming suspicious, we might look to some examples. One example might be the concept of stimming. Now, this might not be a familiar concept to some of you, it will be to others. Stimming is otherwise known as self-stimulatory behaviour. It's certain kind of motor movements which neurodivergent individuals may engage in, often as a coping mechanism for stress. This can include things like hand flapping, for example. Now, if this behaviour is seen as unusual or erratic or odd by an objective observer, they may see it as suspicious, when in fact there is nothing suspicious about it at all. It is simply a presentation of that person's neurodivergence. And that can sort of begin almost a snowball effect with the following interactions. If there is an interaction between an officer and a neurodivergent individual, that individual may find it very stressful. They may be very anxious, more anxious than many others. And this can appear to manifest itself in a way which seems challenging, that individual may appear to be being deliberately difficult or evasive, when in fact they are struggling to engage with something which is quite directly problematic for them. For example, if we're talking about, say, an autistic individual, if they find certain aspects of an interaction difficult, like direct verbal interaction or open questions, they may really struggle to engage with and interact with an officer who is talking to them. And their behaviour in response to that may not be considered to be compliant. It may not be considered to be reasonable, when in fact it's a response, an anxiety response to something they're struggling with. We can also add some other things as well, which may have nothing to do with the interaction itself, but might be about the environment around the interaction. So sirens can be a significant problem for some individuals. Physical touch or physical restraint can be a significant problem. If an interaction takes place in a crowded area, that may be challenging. For individuals who have difficulty maintaining attention, they may appear disengaged or rude or non-compliant when they're engaging with an officer, when it's not actually intended in that manner. So there are quite a number of potential challenges when these interactions are happening, which can be misconstrued and can lead to an escalation on the basis that this is a person who is suspicious, who is being difficult or challenging. Now, obviously, I've just tried to kind of scratch the surface a little bit there, and I cannot pretend to say that that's the end of everything one might say about those issues, but I'm trying to be as concise as I can. In terms of custody, there are a number of potential issues that can arise. Obviously, if somebody is brought to custody, there's a likelihood they're going to be detained for a significant period of time and potentially questioned in interview. Interviews can be particularly problematic if neurodivergent individuals struggle with things like memory, with language, and with the kind of question style that might be used in a standard interview, particularly very open questions. Confinement in a cell per se could be challenging for anybody who's in there, but for somebody who needs particular rituals or items needed in order to cope with stress, having those restrictions on them may be extremely traumatic. If we add to that things like physical interaction, the sensory environment of custody, noise, lights, smells, and the very unfamiliar routines that someone's going through, that can all add to significant distress and escalation. I'm aware I'm probably running out of time now, so I will very quickly conclude. In terms of lawyers, appropriate adults and liaison and diversion services, I think the problems are similar. The challenge is the same. Without specific knowledge, awareness, and understanding, it's very difficult for individuals to communicate appropriately and effectively with neurodivergent individuals. And there's evidence to suggest that that's just not in place at the moment. That's a very brief idea about what I think we should think about in terms of changing things. Training and awareness and screening would be probably the number 1 and 2 things which I think would be worth talking about. And I know we've got that as part of the Q&A, so I'll save that for that. And just to finish off, if there's anything else you'd like to read about, I've got a few suggested bits of reading here, so feel free to kind of follow the links. I'm sure the slides will be distributed afterwards. But thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry I've gone over. I'm sorry it was whistle stop, but I appreciate the centre having me talk.
Well, thank you, Tom, and it was really on point and clear, and only a touch over time, so I can't be too harsh on you. I know it was really good introduction and a great start to this seminar. And I now hand over to Detective Constable Nicole Jury for her presentation. I think you're still on mute.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Brilliant. Yeah, I do have someone in with me today for a little bit of tech support and ADHD support. So yeah, thank you very much for having me, and thank you everyone for dialing in today. Tom's obviously given you a great kind of whistle stop tour on some of the side of it he's done, and there is obviously an officer with neurodiversity, but hopefully you'll all get something from it. So yeah, this is me. I am there in the high vis back in the days when I did scene watches. I am incredibly nervous, and unlike Tom, I don't present on a regular basis, or ever actually. I have been told I've only got 10 minutes, which, to be honest, because of the ADHD, I don't have much sense of time. So whether you told me I had 10 minutes or whether you told me I had an hour, I have no idea if I could cover everything I wanted to cover, though I'm sure that's not possible. I do have Mike in with me at the moment to help keep me on track, but the ADHD does mean that sometimes I will get distracted. I won't always know why, and if I can explain it, I will. I've just asked, please be patient and please be kind. I will put myself back on track. It just might take me a minute. But hopefully, yeah, the presentation will run relatively smoothly. So who am I? So obviously I'm here in my role as a detective, and I've been with TVP since 2017. I have included my academic achievements on there, and the only reason I've done that is because I think there is this misconception sometimes, or there has been previously with neurodiversity, where I think there's this idea that we're not as capable or that we can't do things as well as other people. And actually, that's not the case. You know, I did get my degree, I've got my master's, and I'm incredibly proud of those things. But, you know, just because I've had to go about it slightly differently or because of certain challenges I faced, it's not that I can't do it. So that's the only reason that's in there, to be honest. But the main point of this will be sort of my career as a detective. So yeah, I joined in 2017, became accredited as a DC in November of this year. And yeah, certainly hasn't been easy, but it has been fun. I am incredibly proud of the work we do. I think as a department and as a team, as an individual, we've done so much sort of like for the community. And yeah, these are just some of the jobs, sorry, I've been involved in. It hasn't been easy getting here. And as much as I do love CID and I look back on my memories of policing, it's not been easy. And I think as sort of difficult as it is, I kind of want to go into some of the challenges I faced, just to sort of show that journey really, and how much Thames Valley Police has changed and how much work there is still to do. So yeah, this is one of the hardest slides to write, and it is definitely one of the hardest to talk about. Policing is difficult, and I don't just mean in terms of the jobs we do every day or the things we see or the, you know, the experiences, but actually it's a really structured organisation, and there is this idea that a good police officer meets certain requirements. You know, as you go through your career, whether you decide to be, regardless of your rank, but if you decide to progress or even just to become independent, considered fit for independent patrol, and when you leave training school, it's very much a tick box. It's literally a spreadsheet, and these are all these points you have to hit to show that you are a good officer and to show you're a competent officer, and it is very streamlined. I do want to be clear, this isn't a criticism of TVP at all. I love working for this force, and I think they are making huge headway in being more accepting of neurodiversity, of understanding it and of accommodating it. Sort of back at training school, but part of ADHD and part of the dyslexia is a difficulty in retaining and recalling information. So I would sit in the classroom at training school, which was already incredibly difficult because it was a classroom environment. It was sitting still for long periods of a day. And I would find that I wasn't taking anything in because I probably wasn't really concentrating. So then it would get to the practical side of things, and I couldn't do it because I couldn't recall the information that I hadn't retained whilst I was trying to sit in a classroom and struggling to take in the information. So that led to a lot of feedback, sort of quite negative, really. You know, is policing for me? Am I going to achieve what I want to achieve? So I went for a workplace needs assessment. And I was quite late joining the police. I was 27. I turned 28 whilst at training school. And I'd always had these difficulties. You know, even at uni, I couldn't really sit there and listen. It always took me a little bit longer to remember things or to recall them. And then suddenly I had this workplace needs assessment, and they told me that I had traits of ADHD, dyslexia, and potentially dyspraxia. And all of a sudden, so much changed for everyone else. I suddenly had this new labels, but it meant that I was also protected by the Equality Act. So then everyone wanted to try and help. There was this whole world of reasonable adjustments that I didn't even know existed, designed to help me manage in this environment. And what that comes to is that question of what do you need? And the answer is I don't know, because an hour ago I was 28 years old, struggling at training school, not sure if policing was for me and not sure if I was going to progress, to now I'm 28 years old, I've got ADHD, dyslexia and dyspraxia, and everyone's going to help me be a police officer and everyone's going to help me get there. And I didn't have a clue what that meant, and I didn't know how to fully embrace that. And I think to an extent, I probably still don't. So then I got out onto area and everyone was like, don't worry, you'll get to area and you'll be great. And I got to area and I was not great. I wasn't even really very good. I really struggled. The sensory input of being a uniformed officer on a response team with the blue lights and the sirens and the constant radio noise in my ear, it was a huge challenge and it was really, really difficult to manage. So once again, it was like, is this right for me? And I spent a lot of my uniformed career on restricted duties because it was really, really difficult. And then I decided to try and be a detective. So I had the anxiety around that sitting in an office, because is that really different to sitting in a classroom? You know, it felt the same to me. The intensity of the workload, that sort of sitting there all day in one space with the noise distractions. But I applied anyway and I failed. And so once again, I was like, you know, this is something else. This is another negative. But actually, I then got a phone call, and I can safely say that phone call changed my life and changed my career, because I was offered an attachment in CID. And it was huge for me. And I'm so incredibly grateful for that. But what they did tell me was that it was a 3-month attachment. So I felt like I had 3 months to show I'm normal. And for somebody with no concept of time, whether you said 3 months, 3 minutes or 3 years, it would have felt exactly the same to me. But we got there, and it's been, yeah, by far the best experience. And I think it's really highlighted how much the force has changed and how much we recognise neurodiversity now. So it all started because I sat down and I had a one-to-one with my inspector, Laura Corskadden, and she asked me what it's like having ADHD. So it's the first time somebody had actually rephrased the question. And I explained it to her as, it's like you have a thought or you have an idea and then it's gone. And it's like when the raccoon put the candy floss in the water and it just disappeared. So I'm just going to play that clip now, because also it gives me a second to just reset and refocus. But here's what it's like. So yeah, even planning this presentation, I would do a run through and I was like, oh, that sounds really good. And then I'd go to write down what I said, and it's literally that moment the raccoon realizes that the candy floss has gone, because I don't know where that thought went. I don't know what I said, and I've got absolutely no idea where I was going. So I finally had somebody who understood that. My DS and my DI were brilliant. They actually cared and they were interested. And I think Laura was so invested, and still now sends me articles on neurodiversity and interacting and things that are just really interesting. And she gave me this newfound confidence in myself, in my neurodiversity. You know, she wanted the best out of me. And for the first time, I felt comfortable in who I was. And, you know, she's got this completely different view of my neurodiversity. She sees my ADHD as this superpower, because I can hyper-focus and achieve a lot in a short space of time. I can also achieve absolutely nothing in an 8-hour day. It really is twofold, but it was refreshing to have that alternative perspective and to have that support. And actually, for the first time, I felt comfortable to sit down and go, I am really struggling with this, with sitting down all day and trying to focus on the work. So then we had regular meetings, myself, Laura and my sergeant, and we'd sort of go, right, what's going to work? So I'll take a brief walk and I'll come back, I'll sit down and I'll carry on. And that is such a small change for somebody. You can leave your desk, just that permission to move. but it was huge, and it made such a difference to me, and it meant I could actually concentrate, and my anxiety just reduced massively because they understood and because they cared. There are still challenges and there are still struggles. I'm not saying there aren't, but actually we sit down now and we talk about them and we come up with a plan, and it's incredibly productive and it's incredibly understanding. And I am truly grateful to the both of them for what they've given me really over the last 20 months since I joined. So on to sort of a bit more of what Thames Valley Police is doing. So this was how the ADHD support group started. So Laura and I sat down during that one-to-one and she said, let's just change it. Let's make sure that the next police officer that joins who's got neurodiversity has a different experience to what I had. So this is how the network started. We started with a little mind map of what we'd like to achieve, and it just kept growing. What you'll also see there are 3 A4 pieces of paper that are mind maps that didn't fit on the original mind map. And this is very much sort of like 10 minutes inside my head, but this is where it all started. And this is where I think the awareness really began to sort of just become more paramount, really. And I think people were more open to the discussions. So the ADHD network and sort of other works going on. So Detective Inspector Andy Thompson and Sergeant Lucy Gray had already set up an autism support network, and that was for officers and staff, and sort of like to try and again raise awareness and offer support to people. So then Laura and I set up the ADHD Support Network, and these now form part of a wider network that Andy Thompson is overseeing, which is a neurodiversity support network. And that is going to try and offer support to anyone with any of the sort of 7 strands of neurodiversity. I think we're trying to move away from this idea of our limitations and our struggles and our difficulties. And there is still a long way to go, but the progress we've made just in the last sort of couple of years has been huge. I think internally, the aim of the network is to try and give people a safe space, somewhere where they can be completely honest about their experiences and get the support they need without being judged, without fearing that if they mention it to their team or their line managers, they're going to be seen as not coping as well or not capable of doing the role. It's somewhere where they know people are going through the same thing, and we're all at different stages of our journeys, and these journeys never really end. But it's just an opportunity for us to talk and to share and to be open, and hopefully it will give people that little bit of confidence and that little feeling of being comfortable and being accepted that I got from Laura and my Sergeant Lara. We can also help supervisors. So we get quite a few line managers contact us where they want to support their officers and their staff with neurodiversity, but maybe there's questions they don't want to ask them because they want to be seen as that supportive entity and not somebody who's questioning them or might be struggling to understand. And then in terms of offering support to our sort of service users, our victims, our witnesses and our suspects, we want to be more inclusive. We've changed the actual physical appearance of our custody suites, and we want to offer more training to improve the service we offer to the public. And, you know, from the second they make that first call to control room, right the way through to if they have to attend court, where a little bit more sort of the work Tom was talking about comes in as well. By increasing our understanding of neurodiversity and by supporting our officers, we can massively improve the performance, both for Thames Valley Police as a whole, but also, you know, making the people that contact us feel valued and feel supported. We have the best subject matter experts. We have officers and staff who are experiencing the world in a completely different way, who see the struggles, see the challenges with the environments that our service users do. And actually, if we can make them feel comfortable, if we can make them feel empowered, then we can start bridging all those gaps that Tom talked about and really start delivering a holistic service that makes everyone feel comfortable, feel supported and feel understood. And essentially, that's all anyone wants. It just takes a little bit of patience, a little bit of time and an awful lot of understanding. Thank you very much. I'm sorry if I ran over time. I don't know, I couldn't tell you. But yeah, thank you for listening, and I hope to answer any questions that anyone might have.
Fantastic, thank you. And just as with Tom, really clear, insightful, and thank you in particular, because I know that was not the easiest thing that you have in your working day or working week, but you did yourself proud, and thanks so much for being here. So now we're going into the Q&A section, and a number of questions have already come in, so I'm just going to start with your questions, and we'll go for another sort of 15 minutes or so, and then I'll wrap things up. So I think the first question, which is a sort of has come up from a few people, and I'm probably likely to direct this firstly at Tom, I guess, is a question about the overlap or between acquired brain injury and other neurodiversities. So is that included in your definition? How do we struggle? How do we work out that? How do we work with that sort of the overlap between the two?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And, you know, I think it's a bit of an ongoing debate. I guess the point I want to make is I don't want to make neurodiversity a kind of closed category. And actually, my personal view is when we're trying to support people who are neurodivergent, that actually we should be sort of needs led rather than diagnosis or label led. So in that sense, I feel like, you know, acquired brain injury, traumatic brain injury, other conditions like that would absolutely and should absolutely be included, because so many of the needs are the same, so many of the challenges are the same. I know from a technical sort of perspective, there's a debate about genetics and the difference between that and acquiring brain injury, but ultimately I think what we want to do when we're talking about the criminal justice system is make sure that people are supported in their needs, regardless of labels. So I guess that would be my perspective on it.
Great. And Nick, do you want to come in on that at all, or should we move to the next one?
No, I think, yeah, Tom's pretty much covered it, really. I don't think I could add anything more than he could on that one.
I mean, and there's another set of questions, which I guess is what does the system do about the fact that we're increasingly identifying people with neurodivergent means within the process of arrest, charging and taking them into the court. So a couple of people have sort of asked how the system really copes with and should it do different things with people who are neurodivergent. So we've had one question, for example, from someone who's a medical doctor involved in research, asking, should we do screening before we move to prosecution for people with neurodivergence? And equally, I know some of our colleagues at Transform Justice have done some work on assaults on emergency workers, which shows that we're increasingly prosecuting people for those offences. But a lot of people who commit those offences are neurodivergent. So I wondered if either of you had views on what the system should do about the increasing identification of people with neurodivergence coming in through the courts. I don't know if Tom or Nick wants to take that first.
Do you want to go ahead, Nick, or do you want me to?
Yeah, no, you go, Tom, and then I'll follow your lead.
Sure. I mean, this is a really difficult question, because something like screening is, you know, potentially never going to be absolutely 100% accurate. It can be quite difficult to design in a way which captures need and then finds the right support, the right referral. But it seems to me that at the moment, the reality is that there are a lot of neurodivergent individuals passing into the justice system. I don't think there's much doubt about that. And there is a failure to identify that need, whether it's as a suspect, defendant, a victim, whoever. There seems to be a failure to identify that regularly enough, and sometimes just far too late. It seems that a lot of kind of identification and screening isn't even happening until, for example, people are sentenced and in prison, which is, in my view, is just too late. So, you know, in an ideal world, I think we would say that we'd be screening and understanding people's needs before they've got anywhere near the justice system. But if people are being drawn into the justice system as early as possible, would be great. But that does mean designing something that's accessible, usable, for example, for officers, that's not impractical. So it's not an easy thing, but I feel like it's a really important start, because without understanding who is neurodivergent and coming into the justice system, we can't take steps to adapt to their experience.
Nick?
Yeah, I completely agree. And this is why I like Tom going first, because he does articulate the points beautifully. But yeah, I think it's very much something we need to understand and need to be aware of. You know, people aren't criminals because they're neurodiverse, but actually the situation that we've put them in and the way that's been managed has that in some way had an impact. And I think it is it's a very fine line as well, because you want to take it into account as a sort of mitigating factor, but at the same time, you don't want to be justifying every behaviour because they've got neurodiversity. And I think that's something you have to be really aware of as well when you're trying to raise awareness, because actually there is otherwise that tendency for it to be viewed negatively, which is exactly the thing we're trying to move away from. But yeah, I think it is certainly something that needs to be considered. I think it needs to be considered as early as possible, because potentially, yeah, as Tom raised in his presentation, it will change how people interact with us. It will change how people talk to us. You know, are they being non-compliant, or are they so sensory overloaded that they cannot possibly comprehend what's happening? And as they escalate, if we have more officers shouting at them, are they then escalating further because of that additional noise? And I think it's something that comes with training from our end. But I think, yeah, we have to just be really careful sort of going through the process. But as Tom said, if you could get them there before they even reach criminal justice, that would be the dream, and that would be the ideal world.
Absolutely. And I guess I sort of link to this as a question from June Lee, Parents of Traumatised Adopted Teens organisation, I think self-styled the Potato Group. So the question is parents of traumatised adopted teens and those in their 20s, many of whom enter the criminal justice system due to the issues we've highlighted, they're young adults, and so when the parents trying to get in touch about this, the police response is often, well, they're an adult, we can't tell you where they are. If they're in custody, we will phone you if they want your input, but they can't do that because of neurodivergence. So how do we give access to carers and parents of adopted people with neurodivergent needs when the system sometimes treats people just as, well, this is just the system that we have? I wonder if either of you have comments on that.
I'm happy to go first if you want, Nick. Part of me feels like it might be better for you to comment as an actual officer personally.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult one because we are unfortunately constrained by the rules of law, essentially. That means that we can't. But I think, and again, it's that unfortunate situation where it's not until they're in the system that we can start addressing things like this. But, you know, that is where the L&D side of things comes in. So, you know, if they sort of do their assessment and say, well, actually, yeah, there are these additional factors that would mean it would be beneficial, or that we can share that information, then obviously that then is more important, and we can be led by that. But it just comes back to that thing again of we can't do anything until they're part of the system. But, you know, once they're in the system, that is then potentially setting them on a path that we just don't want to. You know, we want to try and help prior to that.
And do either of you have views? This question again asked by in the chat from Anna Doherty, who asks about whether neurodivergence, because we talked a lot about the police, whether it's being a tool considered within how courts operate and the court reforms operate. Do either of you have insights into that? Tom, you're nodding. So
yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk about that. I mean, I could very happily talk about the courts, because that's, to be honest, probably more my focus and interest area in terms of criminal justice research. And I'm not seeing an awful lot of information out there at the moment about what's happening in the court service to adapt to need in terms of experience of things like just environment, for example, but B, in terms of the way courts run, things like trials run and proceedings run. And I think the context we have to be aware of is how much pressure and rush there is on the court system at the moment. And I think that's across the criminal justice system per se, but everybody knows about the court backlog. Everybody knows about how little time there is to do things. And I'm seriously concerned that lots of need is just being missed, partly because we just don't have any kind of systems or processes specifically in place to identify this kind of need. So something that I've been working with some other people for a little while on is trying to develop some kind of health or vulnerability screening tool for courts. So it's not just focused on neurodivergence necessarily, but the idea is to enable courts to identify these things easily so that they can seek referrals, so they can get liaison and diversion involved. But at the moment, I think progress is slow, and I'm not seeing huge amounts happening. It may be that it is, and I'm not aware of it, but yeah, that's kind of my view at the moment.
Nick, did you have a comment on your experience of courts?
I'm sort of with Tom really on the fact that it is slow. I think there are, I know sort of, so we will obviously complete forms if we've got victims or witnesses with neurodiversity. If it's suspects, it kind of tends to get flagged up a bit earlier on. But I think that, you know, you sort of say to witness care, who obviously do a lot of our sort of management for us, say to them they've got neurodiversity and they're still that like, don't quite know what to actually do or how to deal with that. And even for me as an officer, you sort of say to them, just so that you know, I've got this. It won't necessarily hinder me, but it's something you should be aware of. You know, if they're going to start asking me 4 or 5 questions in a row, I'm not going to be able to follow it. And there's still that like, don't quite know what to do or how to respond. So I think there is the potential for progress, and I think they are certainly open to it, but I think practically how that looks in a courtroom at the moment, I think we've still got quite a way to go.
Yeah, I mean, we just to talk a bit about the centre's work sort of in a linked area. So we looked a number of years ago at young adults' experience of court and what could be done to improve it. And we found a lot of young adults found the whole process confusing, didn't understand the language, obviously found it stressful, found basic things like the court environment, being stuck behind a perspex box and not being able to hear what went on, very difficult. And given what we know about the young adult population and the prevalence of neurodiversity amongst the 18 to 25-year-old group, our recommendations to change the court, which were not adopted, which is always a pain. But we heard feedback from the court service saying, well, why would we not just do this for everyone? And I was like, well, that's fine. I would be more than happy that you made court more understandable and less stressful for everyone. But that seemed to be their argument about, we won't do anything about specifically about young adults, but they didn't therefore do anything about it for everyone. But anyway, I will leave that to another day. One question that keeps on coming up, which I think is worth asking, which is about the difficulty of getting a diagnosis. And we've talked a bit about maybe moving away from a diagnosis-based system to one that better identifies needs. And you've talked a bit, Tom, about screening tool. But obviously, what we see from the people commenting in the chat is long waits to get diagnosis. So how is the criminal justice system going to know, even if it wants to respond differently to people with neurodiverse needs, how to do that if there's no diagnosis? And again, it's just a very open question to ask both of you.
I'm happy to go first. Yeah, I mean, it is a really tricky one again. Another difficult question to sort of have a definitive answer. I think my inclination towards moving away from diagnosis-led and towards needs-led is partly because of the fact that there are going to be, you know, thousands, if not millions of people out there who are neurodivergent but are undiagnosed or are waiting for diagnosis, and, you know, their needs can't wait. You know, they are going to require support in whatever context they're in, whether that's education or health or justice or, you know, university, whatever it is. But, you know, the needs are still apparent. So that's why I'm kind of inclined that way anyway. In terms of how you make that work in practice, I mean, to come back to what you said, Phil, I mean, you know, the idea that there are some things that you could just change across the board, which would improve experience for everybody drawn into it, is something I think that should be explored. You know, the justice system has a tendency to be, you know, quite conservative in its approach to things. It doesn't like to change things. It doesn't like to move away from traditional approaches to things. One of the things that comes to mind is the kind of the campaign there has been for several years to try and adapt cross-examination in courts for vulnerable individuals. And, you know, there is a balance that can be struck between getting a fair trial, but making sure something isn't distressing and traumatic. And I feel like that kind of across the board design principle is something that could definitely happen with a bit of forethought. And I mean, one example would be something that Nick raised about making, you know, custody suites less, you know, designed to intimidate and oppress, and to actually make them a bit more sensory friendly in many ways. You know, that's just one suggestion. I know that Nottinghamshire Police have just opened or are opening very soon what they call the first autism-friendly custody suite in the country, which is really interesting. And I know that costs money and it takes time to build custody suites, but stuff like that I think could be really helpful. If it's diagnosis-led, then we're going to get a slowdown, and that's going to make it difficult in many situations, I think. But I don't think I can answer that more definitively, really.
Yeah, similar really. I think so we have started to do that at Thames Valley. I know Tommy mentioned Nottingham, and they are just they're miles ahead in terms of that. Their autism suite is incredible. It's got its own little entrance, and it's completely set up differently. For Thames Valley, some of the work in Loddon, they've now got a it's like a calming wall, so the wall is like a sunset scene type thing, but it's just something to reduce almost the noise in the custody room, and they're looking at sort of making it so that all that area behind the desk is now a lot calmer, and you know, there's less leaflets and things like that. So also the other side of it is, as custody sergeants are completing risk assessments, if they're not really listening because they're busy reading the poster on the wall behind them, you're not actually getting even an accurate reflection of what they feel their needs are, because they either desperately want to get out of that area because it's sensory wise it's overwhelming, or they're not really listening because they're looking at the board, but then they, especially for suspects, they don't want to then lose that of, oh, sorry, I wasn't listening. They're just going to be like, yeah, no, whatever. So then we never quite get that accurate insight into them. But I think the screening's a really good idea. But I think, yeah, if we can just keep doing what we're doing on the environments, we're going to get them telling us what their needs are, and that's incredibly valuable as well, I think, because, you know, they know themselves better than anyone. But as I said in my presentation, actually sometimes saying what do you need is not helpful at all. It's rewording those questions as well. So it's not about going what do you need, it's sort of that, like, how do you manage this? Because you can answer that question. Oh, well, when I'm struggling, I mean, I'm sat here now with a fidget toy. Because it's something that helps me focus. Well, then, okay, so is there any way we can get risk assessments done for people who do need that, to be able to sit in an interview with them, not something that's going to hurt someone, but something that just gives them that sensory input that enables them to fully engage with an interview process? Because actually probation offer a lot more if they admit to the offence in a sort of fair way, and then we could start getting these people out. But we've got to be more accommodating.
Is there any particular distinctive needs for young people around neurodivergence that you've experienced in your time, Nick? I mean, because often this gets framed as sort of around young adults and stuff, but are there particular things around children and young people that you've observed in your time that we practitioners should be aware of?
I think it's just whether you can have those open and honest conversations. So I did an interview a couple of weeks ago, actually, with somebody who was under the age of 18, so had an appropriate adult, which I think always makes it that little bit easier anyway, because you've got them in the room. But, you know, she was quite upset herself, because she was like, nobody ever understands. Nobody ever really gets what's going on, or what that young person is experiencing, or how they're managing. So I'm probably the first time I've done it, actually. I shared some of my experiences. And then it was sort of like we went into the interview room and they hadn't been interviewed before. So it was just sort of explaining the layout and what's going to happen, and that there might be distractions, and that, you know, if they need a minute to just stand up and move around, you know, that's absolutely fine. And I would rather that than them just sitting there getting more and more agitated. I don't think there's enough provisions at the moment, but then I think that's true for neurodiversity across the board. I think it's things we're gradually learning. I mean, you know, you look at like PACE compliance, and that's so old now. I mean, that, you know, even in terms of the digital world, that's not quite caught up yet, let alone in terms of neurodiversity. So we're still quite restricted, but I think where we can, we're making allowances. But it comes back to what I said before, you know, people like me and other officers have got to be comfortable sharing their experiences, and until we make an inclusive and accepting environment for us, they're not going to share those experiences, and certainly not with suspects. But I think gradually, as we start to bring down those barriers, hopefully we will, and it will sort of start to put everyone at ease a little bit more, really.
That's great, thank you. We have classically run out of time. There are 1,001 questions in the chat. We will try and get to some or all of them after this event. But I know we've run out of time, and I don't want to keep people from their lunches and other things. So I just want to give my special thanks to our speakers, who were fantastic. An extra special thank to Nick for being brave in doing this presentation. You were fantastic, and I think it inspired a lot of people on this call. Particular thanks also just internally in the centre to Bella and Suzanne at the centre for organising this day. As we said at the start, we will send round copies of the slides and copies of this recording of the event to everyone. And as I said, this is going to be it's the first of a series of seminars. The only other thing I just wanted to mention, so we've done quite a lot of work around procedural fairness, which I think is part of our approach to how do we make the system look and feel fairer for people, and it involves things like better communication at court. And we have a range of practical guidance documents on our website, and we'll be soon launching a new procedural fairness toolkit as well. So please watch out on our website for that stuff. But yes, thank you to our speakers, thank you to staff at the centre, and just wishing you all a good rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you everyone for coming and listening.
Thanks, everyone.